Sunday morning that it was time, that they were no longer going to allow the protesters out. And certainly not when they began to throw rocks and other items at that storefront. You know, as long as they were protesting peacefully, it didn't seem like the police had any problem with that. But as soon as they began to destroy private property, really within a minute or less, we saw the deployment of that device, whether it was a smoke bomb or tear gas or whatever it was. But that was really, that crossed a line for law enforcement, and it led to them you know, using tactics that we had not yet seen. And this is what happens. You see the folks, it's very painful. You were there, Brittany. You experienced this. I did not, but it sounds awful to have to breathe this stuff in.
It is, and you can see just by the visual evidence that you're watching on your screen right now, the protests that we saw, the hundreds of people that were standing face to face with officers is no more. That crowd has dispersed. It looks like on the right side we're walking with protesters as they walk away from wherever that tear gas was deployed, and we heard even our own reporter just coughing right then. The thing is now, what usually happens, Rick, if we're looking at protests in the past couple weeks, is that crowds disperse, but then they come back or they relocate somewhere else.
Right.
So now it's a matter of, if at 1:45 in the morning on a Sunday, are you going to go back to this same location, or are you going to go back to where officers are standing and where they're standing guard, or are you going to go home, or are you going to relocate and congregate at a different location? So we're looking at officers right now. Protesters, from our vantage point, this is a pretty tight shot, have not made their way back to that front line of officers. If you can imagine, that's where they were standing, having those discussions, having those dialogues. But in the last 15 minutes, as we just saw live on air, things took a turn, and that is what we've been sort of talking about for the past 4 or 5 hours. Things can change so easily in these situations. They are so fluid, and this is me talking as a person that's been on the ground with you know, my colleagues out there. You just never know what's going to happen. So when we would talk to the reporters and ask them, what do you think is going to happen, they truly don't know, because things can change in an instant. This is a live look on the left-hand side of our GDOT camera. It looks like I-75-85 northbound at University Avenue. This is the scene where protesters actually shut down. I know it seems like a long time ago, but around 9 o'clock today, since we first went on air live, protesters went onto the highway and shut it down. They were standing in a straight line. No cars could get through. More protesters, you know, filed in behind them, and they did that for about an hour and a half before you know, officers moved in, advancing towards them with their shields that we see them with now, with their helmets that, again, they are wearing now, and moving towards those protesters. We did see several protesters get arrested live on camera. It was not an arrest where they were you know, pushed to the ground or anything like that. Their face was in the ground, but it wasn't a violent arrest from what we could see. Of course, we wanted to learn exactly how many arrests were made. We know that just in the last few weeks, 500 protesters were arrested, according to Atlanta police. So that number, of course, has since grown because of tonight's arrest. What you're looking at right now, it looks like a tent of some sort with protesters around it, yelling at men in uniform. We know that tear gas was just deployed, so protesters are scattered. Where will they go next is the big question. Hopefully one of our reporters on the ground can answer that question and let us know what they're seeing. Bobeth or Yasmina, can you fill us in?
Actually, we're going to give them a little bit of a break, because I'm told that both of them have actually breathed in some of the chemicals that were released into the air. So we want to give them a chance to catch their breath and clean their eyes. But you're right. I mean, it's sort of like David and Goliath here. You see these protesters, you know, maybe a dozen or so of them on the right-hand side of your screen, sort of, you know, shouting into the wind in a way, shouting at these members at that tactical vehicle. And the law enforcement officers, the SWAT members, or whoever it is, they are adamant to keep these protests going, even as we continue to see a number of other people disperse and go, perhaps go home or go in another direction. You know, one of the things that we saw, Brittany, in the protests that you were covering a couple of weeks back was the ability that the police had not just to disperse the crowds initially with a tear gas or something, but to also then do a sweep of the streets, almost like a grid going up and down literally every single street to make sure that any protesters who may have tried to you know, sort of hide out and wait for things to die down so that they could come back out. You know, the police wanted to make sure that that was not the case, that those people were not able to come out and cause any more damage. But here we just simply don't have those numbers. We don't have, I mean, there's certainly a lot of law enforcement out there, but not what we saw a couple of weeks ago. And like I said, the National Guard is not there as well. And they provided a big boost, you know, not just tactically, but also just in terms of, you know, sheer intimidation factor, I guess. If you were a protester out in the street looking to cause trouble, and all of a sudden you see, you know, you see all of those men and women in uniform coming at you, you know, it might cause you to think twice before going ahead and doing anything. But things do seem to have calmed down a bit as we come up on about 10 minutes before 2 a.m. Sunday morning. It's been a long night. Saturday was a long day for the protesters. Also a day in which we saw and learned of the resignation of longtime Atlanta Police Department Chief Erica Shields, who stepped down from her position after many years with the department. Over 20 years plus with the department. She has resigned her position. But that, you know, not enough as far as these protesters.
That West Peachtree and stuff. If it's not West Peachtree and stuff, it's not West Peachtree and stuff.
Gas stations that are nearby. Going inside, and we don't know exactly what we're looking at because it's obviously there's a lot in our way. But if this is similar to what we have seen in the past, perhaps there is some looting going on. Again, we hope that's not the case, but it looks like it may be.
Right, they are inside the store. We see several people. We just saw a person try to throw a rock. There he goes again at the window or the door of that store. We're working to learn what store this is and where this store is. If producers can work to get that information just to give a reference point. But more people are descending upon this store as some people are inside, some people are outside, now throwing rocks repeatedly. Looks like he's going to continue to pick up and throw that rock until that window and that glass breaks. So, of course, we're going to hang on this shot so we can see what develops and what happens. This is 24 plus hours of protests here in Atlanta. This is the turn that it has taken. We've been talking about this all night. We didn't see it up until now at 2 a.m. Sunday morning. This is the food mart, it looks like. I'm looking at the Texaco station just by the Wendy's. If we can go back to that shot just so we can see what's happening. But we saw some people trying to break into
here we go.
Right, here we go with the officers in riot gear. This is a scene that we've seen over and over again when those buildings begin to get vandalized. Officers come out in that show of force, Rick, that you were talking about. They have their bats, their batons, they have their face shields and their gas masks, and they have what I'm assuming are zip ties on their waist, as they always carry those. So they are advancing towards the group of people who are in that area, some of which are trying to break into a building. Let's see where they go. Let's see where they're headed and what they do next. If we can zoom out a little bit. Oh, and look who's behind them. We have more officers, Atlanta police in different riot gear as they continue to move forward. And we're just going to continue to follow them. This is all developing at 1:53 in the morning. It was mainly peaceful up until this point. We did have a couple of fires that were set, but in terms of the interactions between police and protesters, it was peaceful. But we know that we had tear gas just a few minutes ago where even our reporters were impacted by that. And we saw people running and coughing and covering their mouths. And officers right now moving towards that convenience store at the Texaco, it looks like, as some people were outside throwing what seems to be a rock or some sort of hard object at the window or the door of that food mart. It looks like they were going to continue to throw it until that glass shattered. Officers, though, are not having it. They have moved closer to that store, and we're going to hang on this shot just so we can see exactly what they do next. Of course, we see their gas masks on. so we can connect the dots there and we know what has happened before. So right now it looks like they have that entire perimeter. If we're going by our images on our screen right now, we're going by our photographers on the ground. Looks like that entire perimeter around the Texaco, which is very close to the Wendy's, by the way, has been blocked off and is now surrounded with Atlanta police officers. And honestly, Rick, these officers came out of nowhere. These are not the officers that we saw before in Bo Beth Yates's shot and Yasmina Alston's shot and live shots. These officers came out of nowhere. So they are definitely here. There's several of them as they descend upon this area where people are trying to and successfully did break into a convenience store there.
It's sort of like the arrival of the cavalry. They came in and they began to push these rioters out, you know, and this is where protesters go from being protesters to being criminals, and we've just watched it with those people who were participating in trying to break the windows and break into that convenience store, and that seems to be the red line. Law enforcement will not let the protesters cross. They do not want to see any destruction of property, and that is when they move in. We had those images of the convenience store with the people inside looting, and I would say it was probably, we had those shots for less than a minute, and then all of a sudden we saw that line of officers carrying batons moving their way towards those people who were destroying that private property there. So that is really, that's going to be, you know, that's going to be a line that the police will not let the protesters cross. As we take a look at, perhaps here's a young man that may have found himself under arrest. It's a little hard to tell by what we're looking at here, but police evidently moving him, taking him, you can see, in a different direction away from those crowds. They are trying to clear the scene. We've mentioned, though, that the state troopers are there now as well. We've mentioned that there is no curfew in place. So in terms of enforcing something and telling people they must get off the streets, it's something that the police are, you know, they do not have a curfew that they can point to. But clearly, as soon as someone begins to take part in the destruction of property, you know, that is against the law, and that gives these officers the opportunity to lawfully go in and get these people out of there.
And it looks like something is happening to the right of the screen, just behind that SWAT truck, so it's hard to see, as we saw some officers grabbing a man by his arm and walking him to a certain area. It looks like to have a conversation. We don't know if he's being detained or whatever else. Something is unfolding behind that SWAT truck there as more protesters looks like are walking up the ramp or some sort of ramp right now. This is a pretty tight shot, so we're trying to get an idea of what's going on. It looks like some people are by that food mart or by a convenience store. More officers now descending upon this area. This is such a different area. Looks like we do have Bo Beth Yates. Is she ready? Bo Beth Yates on the left side of our screen is standing there. Bo Beth, what's going on? A lot has happened. What's going on? A lot has happened.
Yeah, definitely it was. Like, when the chaos ensued and they started breaking into that store, they let out a tear gas. That plume was extremely strong, and folks started fleeing. We were overcome to a point where our throat, our eyes, everything was burning. And I think being under this overpass made it worse, and that plume just made everything kind of a little bit stronger. Then, and now what has happened is the group that ran away are slowly trickling their way back, and they're trying to get to the other side. And as a few of them made it through, now officers are stomping them, saying they cannot pass. These people are saying that they're trying to get to their home and they live on the other side, and they can't. Now, also, we've also seen or heard officers get on the intercom saying, please disperse, go home now. You need to go home now, which makes us believe that they're about to let go another round of tear gas. But again, you have a group of protesters here saying they live on the other side and they cannot get through because officers aren't letting them. Well, now they're letting a few of them through. They're letting a few of them through. They're letting them walk through. A couple of them are holding their hands up to show that they don't have anything. Now they're saying no, now they're saying no, and they're pushing them back. I think there's a little bit of a confusion because the group at the front, the officers at the front told them they could go through. Then the ones on the back told them no. So now the whole group that claims they live on the other side of this are stuck here. They say they can't go home, even though officers are on intercom saying, you know, disperse, disperse. So I'm not really sure what exactly is going to happen now, but hopefully they do not throw another round of tear gas because of the overpass. It's just extremely strong, and it just gets trapped underneath that overpass, and it's just been really, like for us, it was difficult. In fact, one of the protesters had to pour milk on both me and my photographer, Eric Sanders, because we were just overcome. Our throats were burning, our eyes were burning, and to be honest, I think this was stronger than what they were throwing last week, because last week was nothing like this. I mean, this was a lot.
Bobeth, if you can, and I don't want you to talk too much if it burns, so let me know. But if you can, walk us through what has unfolded in the past few minutes from the first deployment of tear gas, and then the looting, and so much has happened. If you can just walk us through that timeline.
Well, it all happened in probably less than 10 minutes. You know, as you saw, for hours, they were just on this line where officers were lining the on-ramp where 75 is. A group started making their way south towards the gas station. The Citgo, or the BP gas station, has a store out front, I should say, that's called To Go. As protesters started throwing, I guess, rocks and breaking the glass and getting inside that store, then officers started to respond. They threw the tear gas. The plume just started moving towards us, and I mean, as it got to us, it was just so strong. I mean, we had to be over 100 feet away from where it was, and you can still feel it. And then as we ran away from it, it still was strong. And going underneath the overpass, I think, just made it worse. Like, everything burned, your eyes, your throat. Like, I could not speak for a good moment.
As we take a look at these protesters, they're sort of standing by the side of the road. Bobeth, are those are the protesters that claim that they can't get home because the officers won't let them go where they want to go?
Yeah, so this group is claiming they live on the other side of this street. A lot of them are here trying to reason with law enforcement, saying, hey, you're telling us to disperse. We live over there. We're trying to get over there, but they will not let them get past. And there's a group on both ends of this intersection, and no one is being allowed through at this point. At one point, they started to let people through, but that was like the front line. And then the back line was like, no, push them back. And now they're just gathered on the side, not sure really what to do.
Bobeth, do you still see Georgia State Patrol officers out there?
No, it looks like they're gone. They were blocking the street earlier on the other side where we started, but cars started coming down the street, so I'm assuming they're no longer blocking the highway. Or I should know, not the highway, University.
And Bobeth, I mean, after deploying the tear gas or whatever it was that they put out there, how would you describe the interactions now between some of these stragglers and law enforcement? Is it just them trying to plead their case? Let us go home.
Yes, for the most part. There is a couple people that, like this one young lady in the pink, I don't know if you could see her, she has her hands up and she's just hasn't spoken to them, but she's just, she was just kind of upset because she's just like, why would you get to this point? But you have to also understand they were very peaceful prior to any business being broken into. And then when that happened is where the tear gas came out. So a lot of these people have just been and say, you know what, if you want us to go, let us go now. Let's go home, but we can't do that unless we pass your barricade.
Beth Yates down among the protesters for us. It is just after 2 a.m. Saturday night, Sunday morning, and we are watching the protests that have been taking place for the better part of the last 24 hours after the death of 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks. Sparked a new wave of protests, more protests in a city where tensions were already high after a week plus of protests that were sparked by the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Protests that have been taking place all over the country, pleading for reform, for justice, for better treatment of minorities at the hands of law enforcement here in this country. And it seemed as though we were sort of reaching a point of understanding, perhaps, where there was the beginning of a growing acceptance that change was needed. We've heard from many lawmakers who are pushing for a hate crimes bill at the state capitol here in Atlanta. Georgia, one of only 4 states that does not have a hate crimes law on the books, and that has been gaining momentum. A number of changes have been afoot, but then Friday night we learned of the death of Mr. Brooks, who was unarmed at the hands of 2 white police officers in the parking lot of a Wendy's restaurant on the south side of Atlanta. This is a young man who tried to resist his arrest and get away from police. There was a tussle that eventually resulted in Rayshard Brooks being shot at. We're told that perhaps 3 bullets fired at Brooks by one of the officers involved. That officer has been fired now. But there is new body cam video that has been released just within the last several hours that we have been showing on our website, cbs46.com, also on our streaming app. It gives new vantage points and new angles that investigators will be using as they try to piece together exactly what happened, what led up to the death of this young man, why was deadly force used, and was it justified? That's what we will be hearing from investigators and also from the prosecutor, who ultimately has to make the final decision as to whether or not these officers should be criminally charged for their actions in the death of Mr. Brooks, who we should mention had fallen asleep in his car. That's the reports were that people had called 911. That there was a man asleep at the wheel in the drive-through at the Wendy's restaurant. It was causing a backup with other vehicles, other customers. And so police came out, and one of the body cam videos that we have that we will have been showing really gives you a real good sense of the conversation between Rayshard Brooks and the officers prior to the shooting. Where you really do hear the officers. You can hear the way that they talk to Mr. Brooks. I think that most people would agree. They spoke to him in a very professional tone, tried to piece together a story that he was telling them that didn't make sense. Frankly, he was claiming that he had not been behind the wheel of the car, that someone else had dropped him off there. He didn't know where he was when officers tried to ask him where he was located. He gave several incorrect answers, didn't even know the county that he was in, thinking that he was someplace that he wasn't. So clearly there was something that was impairing Mr. Brooks's behavior, officers even giving him the opportunity to say whether he had any medical conditions or injuries or anything that might have been causing him to give these incorrect answers. And then he failed a field sobriety test. And that was when the officers decided that, as we take a look on the right-hand side of the screen, law enforcement at that overpass that we've been talking so much about. But that was when officers decided to cuff Mr. Brooks, and it was during that moment when they tried to apprehend him and cuff him with his hands behind his back that Brooks broke free from them. The scuffle between them took place. At some point, Brooks was able to get his hands on one of the officers' taser guns, and you can see in one of the videos that have been released as Brooks turns and tries to fire one of the tasers in the direction of the officers. You could see a spark, perhaps indicating that the gun did go off, the taser did go off, and then the fatal shots were fired by one of the police officers involved. And so these are the protests that have now stemmed from that, and it is now well into early Sunday morning. And there still is a pretty decent show of protesters on the street there, and an even stronger show of force from law enforcement that has decided that they're ready to shut this thing down.
Yeah, we're seeing more officers walking towards our cameras right now. Let's go to Yasmina Alston, who can give us a better idea of what's happening.
Yeah, Brittany, you can see that now police have moved into that area where we initially saw protesters. A lot happened in the last 30 minutes. There was tear gas, which was pretty bad. But the majority of the protesters that were here have been moved away from this area. I am still hearing some yelling, but for the most part, they've been cleared. Back to you guys.
All right, Yasmina, and you really just see an overwhelming show of force. These are the officers with their shields moving through. We've seen law enforcement from a number of different agencies, that all of whom have responded to these protests. There's the Wendy's restaurant where Mr. Brooks was killed on Friday night, where he died on Friday night. That restaurant has been burned to the ground. We saw a number of other fires in the nearby vicinity, the neighborhood. There was perhaps a trash dumpster that was lit on fire as recently as about a half an hour or so ago. Tear gas was deployed once we saw the looting, once we saw the destruction of private property at a couple of gas stations there on the scene. That's when the police moved in and they released the tear gas. But here is a real clear shot. I don't know whether, Bobeth, you're able to hear us. We see you.
I'm here.
Okay, so what are we looking at? What is this? Describe it for us.
This is a law enforcement. I'm not sure which one, but they're literally walking from under the overpass, and they're walking past, and they're literally moving officers and everyone, and they're telling everyone to move at the moment. We're literally guiding us as they kind of sandwich in the protesters in between the other line of officers, and you can hear them making noise as they walk and as they're walking by us. So they're stopping right now. There's only maybe a handful of protesters still out here, but the group has met the other group of protesters. Officers are in front of us right now. They're telling us we have to move. And as they walk right in, but right now they've literally come upon the other group of law enforcement, and no protesters are here at the moment. They're literally just lining the group, and as they make their way in, they're telling everyone that is still around they have to move. I want to say I only see maybe 5 protesters out here. And so you really have law enforcement lining with the other group of law enforcement.
So, Bobeth, you see a couple of protesters to the left really sandwiched between these two lines of law enforcement here. Are these the only people that you see, just to double check, the only people that you see that are not law enforcement outside right now?
Yes, there's right now it just seems to be 4. There was another 5th one, but that seems to be walking away. There were a larger group here, and they actually begged the officers that were here as the other group of officers walked down. They were begging them, saying, "Hey, can you let us through?" And one of the officers broke line, came out, and escorted them on the back side of the officers that were lining the street as the other group marched down the street. So all of those protesters that were, saying, hey, we're trying to get to a car, we're trying to get home, they were escorted by what I believe is an Atlanta police officer to the other side. Now you just have the two group of law enforcement and just three protesters sandwiched in between. And it seems like those three are now being allowed to leave.
Boba, do you know what they're saying to each other? Can you hear?
Well, the protesters in the pink is saying that you told us we couldn't leave, so we were standing here, and now you have the other group yelling at us, telling us we need to leave. So we wanted to leave in the first place, and you didn't let us. But, you see one individual has her hands up just in case. But at this point, they were the last protesters here. You can see the line that was originally here now starting to break up a little bit. The new line of officers that started to march down, they're still in formation. I can't really make out what they just yelled, but they definitely seem like they're going to continue walking down the street, making sure there aren't any protesters just lingering around anywhere.
And that's the sweep that Rick was talking about just a few minutes ago, that we see the tear gas deployed, we see them getting all the protesters out from a certain area, and then they do a sort of sweep through all of the streets, the main streets of the area, and then the side streets as well. This protest that has been going on since Friday night definitely has had so many ups and downs. We had moments of chaos and moments of calm, and this is a moment of calm right now as we empty these streets, empty the street of University Avenue. Several hours after this protest first started, we do not see a protester in sight, nothing but law enforcement, nothing but shields and batons. We have vests, and we also have those helmets as well as they move through those streets, and our protesters are told to leave, Rick.
I'm just amazed, I think, at the professionalism of the police. This is what they train for. This is what they're supposed to do. And, we have not seen any kind of, violent confrontations between the police. We have not seen any of the officers need to use their batons or any of the other weapons that they have at their disposal. They have just simply been moving in the direction that they want to move in, trying to get the protesters to move in the direction they want the protesters to move in. And it really has been carried out in a way that I think has been very effective and very professional. And of course, this comes at a very difficult time for law enforcement here in the city of Atlanta, very difficult time for the Atlanta Police Department. The chief of that department has just stepped down, resigning on Saturday. There is an acting chief in place, but a lot of questions about exactly what is the future for the department. Where do they go from here? What will new leadership bring with them when they come on board, and they will. This is something that a lot of officers, they are human beings. And they are very upset. I mean, I have not been in touch with any law enforcement sources today, but I know from, talking to a lot of them over the last couple of weeks that, that they are very upset that there are bad apples in their ranks, officers that engage in the kinds of behavior that can sometimes lead to these kinds of protests. Now, whether or not the officers who were involved last night in the confrontation with Rayshard Brooks, whether or not they committed any crimes, we will have to wait and see. The district attorney in Fulton County will have the ultimate decision on whether or not to press criminal charges against these two officers, although we do know that one of them has already been fired. That's Officer Garrett Rolfe, who has been fired. We heard his voice. He was the one doing most of the talking with Rayshard Brooks when they initially confronted him and started asking him questions about, what he was doing there. That officer has been fired. Devin Bronson, the other officer, only a couple of years on the force, has been assigned administrative, basically desk duty, while this investigation is carried out by GBI. A lot of videotape to look at. We have the Bodycam video that we've just gotten over the last couple of hours that you can find on our website if you haven't had a chance to see it. It does not show the fatal shots, the firing of the fatal shots, but it shows what led up to it, including a breathalyzer test that we're told Rayshard Brooks failed, even though he claimed to have only had a drink. One margarita is what he told the police officer he had been drinking. The officer is very skeptical of that. And then here's where it all goes south. Watch this as they try to cuff him. He resists. The scuffle ends with the body cam falling off of the officer and pointing upwards, as you can see. But at some point, Rayshard Brooks gets a hold of one of the officer's taser guns and while running away, turns back to fire that taser gun in the direction of the officers, and that is when the fatal shots were fired, striking and killing Mr. Brooks.
And so the question that people are raising, including the attorneys for the family, which is Chris Stewart and Justin Miller, they're wondering why any gunshots were fired for a non-lethal weapon, which is, in fact, a taser. And so that's the question so many people are raising. I don't want to lose sight of why people have come out to protest in the first place, not only in Atlanta, but really in major cities all across the country. It's because of what we saw with George Floyd. It's because of what we saw with Ahmaud Arbery. It's because of what we saw with Rayshard Brooks on Friday night. They say that they are tired of black men dying, and they are tired of black people dying, and they're tired of the injustices and the inequalities with the black community and anyone who is not black. So we're gonna look at this live picture right now just to get you up to speed as to what is happening live at 2:21 in the morning. It has been a long few days and a very early morning here as protests continue for maybe, what is it, Rick, 24, 25, 26 hours right now. Yeah. The scene has changed from mostly protesters. If you remember how many protesters had descended there upon that intersection and upon that street of University Avenue in front of the Wendy's. I think our reporter said at one point there were hundreds of protesters. Now it is all law enforcement as they walk throughout the streets. This is a live image right now of them doing that sweep that Rick was talking about. We've seen it in downtown Atlanta with protest after protest, week after week. As soon as they deploy that tear gas, as soon as they get every single protester out of that area, they walk the streets just to make sure they left no stone unturned and that there aren't any protesters that are still there. We're gonna head out to our crews that are still out there. They've been doing a great job all night. Bobeth Yates is still at the overpass that is by the highway. The scene is cleared, Bobeth, right?
For the most part, yes. This street where you had all the protesters has been cleared. Right now, what we just learned was that group of law enforcement that was making their way down the street was from the Georgia Department of Corrections. They have gone onto a side street now where some protesters were still hanging out, and now they're trying to move them from there. But again, it's really just a handful of people, mostly officers. It seems like, I don't know if they just let off a tear gas or a firecracker, but they're approaching the protesters, and it's almost like a dead end because behind the protesters, it seems to be like just overgrown bushes and just a fence. So they're continuing to march towards the last small group that's still there. And I'm hoping they will disperse soon without any incident.
Let's hope so. And as your camera pans around there, Bobeth, we look at these scenes, can you kind of give us the lay of the land, where the Wendy's is, where the gas station is, that was looted is? Where is it all located?
So if you look directly in front of us where you see those lights, that on the backside of that is where the Wendy's is. So you can see to the left, and then right next to the gas station that was looted is that BP is where the BP is on right next to the Wendy's, and that store that is connected to the BP is where the looting happened, right where it says to go.
And it looks like there is some damage to that to-go store.
Yes, definitely. It definitely seems like the glass is broken out. You know, people were walking in there and coming back out. But what's funny is the Chevron is still open, and people are still going inside there to shop.
Well,
Yeah,
you
so,
get a little thirsty
literally
doing all of the,
right next door.
protesting. Well, we take a look at these
so
images.
it's really interesting.
And they are images that have become all too familiar here in Atlanta over the last several weeks. Here in Atlanta and across the country as well, where we see massive law enforcement out on the streets trying to push protesters away after a night of protesting that began peaceful, but then got ugly, and that's really when law enforcement moved in, Brittany. They seemed more than fine hanging back and letting the protesters, have their say as long as they wanted. It was when they started to go after the gas station and start
I want you to focus on the tip of my finger.
That's when they had had enough. On the right-hand side of the screen is the Bodycam video, and you can see right there, that is Rayshard Brooks, 27 years old, taking a field sobriety test that he failed. And it was the result of this failed test and other information gathered by the police officer that they decided to put him under arrest. They explained to him that they were concerned about his ability to operate a motor vehicle, that he had had too much to drink, and that he shouldn't be driving. And that is why they began to put him in cuffs. And it was while his hands were behind his back and the officer was trying to put the cuffs on that Rayshard Brooks resisted and broke free. And that is what led to the firing of those fatal shots.
Right, and we've seen on the video that he was running and turned around with that, what we believe to be was an apparent taser in his hand, turned around for a quick second, and that's when those shots were fired. Something else that we saw in this body cam video from another angle earlier today, Brooks and these officers were talking for a considerable amount of time as I asked him some questions. One question that they asked him was, can we pat you down? Yeah. And he said, oh, absolutely, absolutely. And he turned around and he put his hands on the car, it looked like, and he allowed officers to pat him down. They said, what's in your pocket? And he said, oh, just a stack of money, just a couple of hundreds. So this interaction, as we're looking at right now, was calm, cool, and collected between Brooks and those officers. They're still talking now. At some point, we heard them cracking jokes, but this is where, if you're watching live right now, things took a turn. This is a dash cam video just to show another angle of that same, that tussle, that confrontation between officers and Brooks as they tried to put him under arrest and put his hands behind his back, and he took them to the ground. You can see he's taking the taser out of the officer's hands, and we're watching this live. This is what happened on Friday night in the parking lot of the Wendy's off of University Avenue. This is what has led to all the protests we've seen since Friday night, now going into 2:27 in the morning on Sunday. The taser is grabbed out of one of the officer's hands, according to this video you're watching, and then that's when we see Brooks runs away. Another angle picks up, and we know that that surveillance video that we saw, if we can get to that, he turns around and he is shot. There it is. He turns around for a quick second, and that is when those shots were fired, killing Rayshard Brooks. You have a live look right now. These are the final images right now of University Avenue. It has seen a lot of ups and downs throughout the entire day, going into Sunday morning, as we don't see one protester in sight, but nothing but law enforcement descending upon that intersection.
Well, we are going to continue to follow this story, of course. It'll be very interesting to see and to hear from Mayor Bottoms on Sunday once the sun comes up to see whether or not she imposes a curfew as she did a week plus ago.